Welcome back to Conspiracy Crashers. In this episode, we are going back over 50 years ago and looking up at the moon over 238,000 miles away. We've always been told that United States astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were the first of a handful to walk on the moon, but more and more people are starting to believe they never went at all, and for very good reason. There are a lot of new breakthroughs and questions surrounding the landings, so what really happened a long time ago on a moon far, far away? In this episode, we will try to answer that very question.
After World War II, there was a power vacuum between two nations. These two countries, the USA and Soviet Union, filled this vacuum and became the only two superpowers in the world. At this time, the Cold War began, and the race to spread ideology by proving themselves each the superior country started. Social, political, and economic competition began between these two countries and spread throughout the globe, each challenging each other by trying to be the main influence in second and third world countries in an effort to gain world superiority. The US and USSR competed and built larger and larger nuclear bombs. Russia also began dominating in a particular field early. This field was the space race. Russia was the first in space by launching the satellite Sputnik in 1957. Russia also began launching several animals into space as well, in ships designed to test the survivability of living beings outside of our atmosphere. Their early successes were a crippling blow to the esteem of the United States, which at this time saw themselves to be financially, technologically, and socially superior to their Cold War enemies. It wasn't until a speech was given by a very popular President John F. Kennedy in 1962 that it became paramount to America's leadership to get a man on the moon first, which was the symbolic finish line of the space race.
Let's briefly go over the timeline of the moon missions to better understand the overall picture. In August of 1958, we started attempting unmanned missions to orbit the moon with the Pioneer and Ranger missions. There were a lot of failures in these missions, including booster failures and guidance failures that caused numerous missions to be a total loss. Later, in May of 1966, we landed on the moon with the unmanned Surveyor missions, which continued until Surveyor 7 in January of 1968. These were largely successful missions with only 2 lost due to crashing into the moon. Finally, we get into the Apollo program, where the main goal was to get a man on the moon. There were numerous unmanned test launches of the Saturn rocket with the Apollo module on top before the first Apollo mission. On January 27, 1967, the Apollo 1 mission was to conduct a simulated launch of an unfueled Saturn rocket from Cape Canaveral with 3 astronauts aboard. During the simulation, there were many issues with electrical short circuits causing a loss in communication and finally a power surge causing the tragic fire in the cabin of the Apollo capsule. Unfortunately, all 3 crew perished in the fire. The missions were put on hold while being thoroughly re-evaluated. On November 9, 1967, the Apollo 4 launched with no crew aboard. 3 months later, Apollo 5 launched an unmanned lunar module into space for further testing. Apollo 6 was the final unmanned launch in April of 1968. Apollo 7 through 10 were all manned, but they only orbited the moon or Earth before returning. Finally, on July 16th of 1969, Apollo 11 launched, and 4 days later, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were allegedly the first men to walk on the moon. The entire mission lasted 8 days before returning safely to Earth. Apollo 12 to 17 continued through December of 1972, which all landed on the moon with the exception of Apollo 13, which had significant malfunctions that forced the cancellation of the landing. Before we get into the bizarre and unusual circumstances surrounding the moon landings, let's take a quick look at this clip of Buzz Aldrin telling a child they never happened.
Why has nobody been to the moon in such a long time?
That's not an 8-year-old's question. That's my question. I want to know, but I think I know. Because we didn't go there, and that's the way it happened. And if it didn't happen, it's nice to know why it didn't happen, so in the future, if we want to keep doing something, we need to know why something stopped in the past that we wanted to keep it going. Money is a good thing.
As you can see here, Buzz stated we did not go, and then oddly says the reason why is that money is a good thing. As we all know, the Cold War was a battle of resources. Whichever country ran out of resources first lost. The space race was a very expensive endeavor for both countries and was a leading factor that caused the USSR to collapse. It would have been a smart tactic if the United States could have faked the majority of its achievements in space. The amount of money saved would have been immense and would give the US a victory in a race it was already losing. The one critical resource the US had that Russia did not was Hollywood.
Let's go into some of the reasons why people suspect we have never actually been to the moon. There are so many things that don't make sense when talking about the moon landing. Many of these circumstances create doubt in the official story. The Van Allen radiation belt is a zone of energetic charged particles, most of which originate from the solar wind, that are captured by and held around a planet by that planet's magnetic field. Earth has two belts and sometimes more temporarily. The Apollo 11 mission entered the Van Allen belt encountering radiation. The astronauts received anywhere from 0.16 to 1.14 rads. A chest x-ray is 0.1 rads, 1,000 times stronger than airport x-rays, which would destroy film. If this is so, then how did the cameras survive the radiation of outer space? Apollo 11 cameras were Hasselblad 500L data cameras. There was nothing unique about these cameras, and they were not insulated, yet they made it through the radiation of space to record the footage on the moon. This doesn't make sense. According to NASA, the sun is the only source of light in the moon landing videos and photos. If this is the case, then you should not be able to see anything in the shadow. We understand it's daytime, and the dark sky might confuse some people. We also realize how ambient light works with and without an atmosphere. But even with modern cameras, let alone 1960s technology, you always can see the ground just as much as any object or person in a shadow. Here's a few quick examples just to give you an idea of what we're talking about. This is a result of camera exposure. The shadows in these moon pictures are pitch black. Nothing can be seen. Another key point with these shadows is that the color red is the first color on the spectrum to turn black. In these pictures, you can see the bright red stripes on the flag. With no raised objects or atmosphere, there would be very little ambient light to account for this. Without artificial lighting, this is literally impossible. The angles of the shadows seen in these pictures were far different than they should be. Why is it that these shadows don't match up? The shadows should be parallel to each other, and these are not. You can see that these run in different directions. These could be lights from a film set. This would explain the angles of shadows created by multiple light sources. Some experts have suggested that the moon's surface may be very reflective. The moon's surface would have been blinding, so the astronauts would not have been able to take photographs or video of their visit to the moon. Another questionable moment during the landing is the American flag apparently flapping in the breeze. There is no atmosphere, which means there would not be any wind on the moon. So how is this possible? NASA did run a pole through the top of the flag to help keep it visible to show for photos. I think it's important to remember that there is still some gravity on the moon, which would give the flag mass. When the astronauts are swinging the flag back and forth while trying to place it, the flag would naturally continue to sway after the pole stops due to the momentum and the moon's gravity fighting to pull it straight down.
We are now going to take a look at the astronauts' first interview after supposedly returning home. Pay attention to their body language and vague and cryptic responses. They are constantly looking down and fidgeting. They look defeated, almost like they are on trial. They look nothing like returning national heroes that just conquered the world. We can't go over the entire interview since it's an hour long, but let's go over some of the most unusual moments. We'll leave a link to the full interview in the description.
In sum and substance, it took us approximately an hour longer to get ready than we had predicted. When we actually descended the ladder, it was found to be very much like the lunar gravity simulations we had performed here on Earth. And no difficulty was...
As you can see, they are extremely nervous and flustered. This is very unusual behavior for a person to act this way after accomplishing the impossible and being celebrated as a national hero. You would think they'd be a lot happier and have a lot more energy. Everything about how they are acting just makes no sense at all. Here's an odd comment from Michael Collins reference how far away they were. Listen to this.
Although we were far from home, we were a lot closer to it than the pure distance might indicate.
It sounds like he's trying to say that they were still on Earth in a cryptic way. Of the three astronauts, he's the only one that does this multiple times. Here, they are asked if they could see stars from the surface, and Collins, who was orbiting the moon, states he could not see any, which he should have clearly been able to. Neil nudges him and looks shocked.
I don't remember seeing any.
Neil, you were.
It's also unusual that they all said they could not see stars, even though the pictures taken from the lunar lander clearly show stars in the background. Another strange occurrence is the missing telemetry data.
I haven't seen anything that indicates the telemetry data is even in existence, and as I said, even if we had it, we don't have the machines to play it back.
Right. We've been unable to track it down. I mean, we don't know where this telemetry data ended up, and we don't know what path it may have taken. So, unfortunately, I'm afraid I can't really give you much of a clue as to where this data ended up and what.
The telemetry data was stored on magnetic tapes and were taken from a camera that was mounted on the side of the lunar lander. The tapes were housed in 14-inch canister reels, which were used as a backup if the live feed went down. After the Apollo 11 returned, the tapes containing the telemetry data were sent to Washington National Records in Sutton, Maryland. The tapes were then somehow lost. NASA states they taped over them on later missions as it was standard practice to reuse the tapes. Why would you record over the first moon landing? You wouldn't unless there was something to hide. Also, how is there a standard practice on the first mission to reuse the tapes, yet all the other missions have their tapes intact? So if NASA faked the moon landing, who in Hollywood would have helped? Most likely it would have been Stanley Kubrick. Kubrick had just directed 2001: A Space Odyssey. The argument is that the Apollo 11 mission would take place and everything would be real. The training, the takeoff, and the landing. Everything but the actual landing on the moon. They would film the live segments of the moon on a soundstage with the help of Kubrick and his knowledge of special effects. It's been said that Kubrick has planted clues into his 1980 film The Shining. These include the Apollo 11 sweater that Daniel wears. He also wears this same sweater while sitting on the carpet that closely resembles the Apollo 11 launch pad. The final clue is room 237. It was originally written in the book that room 217 was where the supernatural events took place. Apollo 11 traveled 237,000 miles to get to the moon. Did Kubrick change this to represent the soundstage where the landings were faked?
There are a lot of strange things involving the moon landing, and it's not very clear cut whether we actually went there or not. The more we looked into it, the more it seemed like it was a hoax. Some things seemed very questionable to say the least. The astronauts' interviews afterwards, the inconsistent angles on shadows, the Van Allen radiation belt, and the lost telemetry data all make the official story questionable. So tell us what you think. Did we go to the moon or was it all just faked? Let us know in the comments down below, and thanks for watching.